The film begins with a view from a cemetery, from which we discover that all of the children's pets, who have just passed away, will be laid to rest there. The scene then switches to a family that is moving into a new home, located right next to a country road, where high-speed truckers often carelessly drive by. Their names are Louie, Rachel, and their 2 young children, Ellie and Gage. The family also owns a cat named Church. Just as the family got off their car, baby Gage starts walking to the middle of the road. Here he almost gets hit by a passing truck if it weren't for their neighbor, Judd, stepping up just in time. Both Rachel and Louie go up to him and thank him. After introducing themselves to one another, Rachel asks Judd about a path leading to the woods just by their new house, as she is curious where it leads. Judd promises to show them what lies beyond it when they've settled into their new home. Later that night, Louie takes a walk in the yard, and looks curiously at the path. Judd, who sees Louie roaming about, promptly invites him over for a beer, and the two chat about the little path by the house. According to Judd, the path leads to the old pet cemetery we saw earlier, and this dangerous road is why the graveyard exists. The reality is that passing vehicles cause numerous animals to die on this road. On the next day, Judd delivers on his promise to accompany the family walk the path, and finally see the pet cemetery for the first time. As they look around the cemetery, Judd provides the children with a lesson about what death means, since he knows how difficult it can be for kids to lose a pet. When they get home, Ellie begins to wonder what if her cat, Church, dies one day, and gets upset at the thought. To cheer her up, Louie assures her that Church isn't going to die anytime soon. Louie works as a doctor at the local college, and on his way to work, he greets the nanny that he recently hired, a middle-aged woman with stomach cancer named Missy. That day at work, the townsfolk are panicking over a man whose head was broken open after he was hit by a passing truck. They rush the man to Louie's care, but the poor man dies in the examination room. Just then, he suddenly grabs Louie, and warns him about the pet cemetery, calling Louie by name though they have never met. He also mentions that he'll come to Louie. That very night, Louie is woken up from his sleep by the man's ghost, who's asking for Louie to follow him. Thinking it's a dream, Louie follows the man down the path to the woods, up until they reach the pet cemetery. According to the man, if one steps past the barrier of the pet cemetery, there lies a forbidden ground where the dead walks, and therefore Louie must not go there. The next thing Louie knows is he wakes up in his bed, but his feet are dirty with mud, meaning that last night might not be just a dream after all. Regardless, he brushes this off, and goes on with his day. That day, Rachel and the kids are leaving to attend her family's Thanksgiving dinner. However, Louie opts to stay home because he has work. After his wife and children leave, their neighbor Judd calls him up, to deliver the bad news that Church the cat has died from getting run over by the damn passing truck just now. Louie comes by to get his daughter's dead cat, Church, and the two men go to the pet cemetery to bury the cat together. Realizing Ellie will be devastated, Judd suggests that they should go over the cemetery's barrier, which is the very place that the ghost from last night told Louie not to go. Louie is not very sure, but follows the man deeper into the woods, until they could hear strong shrieks of animals which spooks Louie, but Judd assures him it's alright. They keep on treading the treacherous path, until they reach a cryptic-looking Native American burial ground. Judd doesn't go into further detail about the ground, and suggests he should bury the cat there. The soil in this burial ground is oddly really hard, so that Louie only finished burying the cat by nighttime. Once they both return home, Judd asks him to keep this a secret, which suggests that there's something special about this burial ground in particular. Confused, Louie doesn't say much to this, and proceeds to call his family to ask how they're doing. With a heavy heart, he is forced to lie about Church's death by telling his daughter that the cat is okay. The following morning, Louie is cleaning up around the house, but when he enters the basement, he surprisingly finds Church very much alive there, screeching at him. Finding this hard to believe, he finds the cat again to take a better look, and discovers that Church smells really bad. What's odd is, the once loving Church is now ferocious, and even scratches Louie in the cheek. Afterwards, Louie heads to Judd's house to ask how is it possible that the cat is alive again. Judd responds by telling a story about a dog he had during his childhood who died, so a neighbor showed him to the Indian burial ground. After Judd buried it there, the dog reappeared, but it wasn't the same animal as before, and he took care of the dog until it eventually died again. He also tells Louis that he wanted Church to come back to life, because such grief of losing a pet is too much for a young kid to bear. Louis then asks if a person was ever buried in the grounds, and a startled Judd says no and harshly suggests that no one ever would. Later that night, once he returns home, Louis is enjoying a hot bath, right when Church throws a dead mouse in the tub. This makes him angry, so he kicks the cat out. The next day marks the return of his family. Ellie asks the father about the cat. She tells him that she had dreamed that Church had died and that he and Judd had buried him. Louis comforts Ellie by saying that the cat is fine. All of them are completely unaware that there is something off about Church other than the fact that he smells like a dead cat now. Just when we thought all is well, something tragic happens. The family's nanny, Missy, decides to hang herself to death, possibly unwilling to live with her cancer any longer. After attending the funeral, little Ellie asks Louis more about death and what happens after, to which Louis replies that he believes there is the afterlife after death. As it turns out, death is a sensitive topic for Rachel, who confides in Louis about how when she was young, her sister Zelda was sick for a long time. Rachel had been left alone and in charge of Zelda by their parents, while Zelda started looking deformed after a while. While taking care of her, Rachel felt really bad because she always wished Zelda would just die. And on the day Zelda finally took her last breath, Rachel felt worse because she was glad for it. Hearing this, Louis comforts her, and tells her it is her parents' fault because they forced her to take care of her sick sister at that age. Despite all the trauma around death, the family eventually recovers and moves on with their life, until one fateful day where they have a picnic out in the yard, and baby Gage is playing with the kite. When the adults aren't watching, Gage drops the kite and follows it as it gets blown away by the wind. Unfortunately, it leads him to the road where a massive truck happens to pass by.
Get the baby!
The truck tragically hits Gage, killing him instantly. This death severely wounds the family, and during the funeral, Louis' father-in-law furiously hits Louis, and blames him for Gage's death. The pain from losing a son prompts Louis to think of the Native American burial ground. And so, Judd, who knows about Louis' plan, pays a visit to the house to warn him against bringing a person back to life. Here Judd finally reveals that it's been done before during the Second World War, by a father who was grieving for his dead son. The father decided to place his son's corpse into the ancient burial ground to bring him back. As it turns out, the result wasn't pretty, because the person who came back to life wasn't the same person as before, and was wreaking havoc around town. As he was out of control, the townsfolk were furious and decided to burn down his house, with the father trapped inside. On the next day, Louis takes his family to the airport to go spend some time with his father-in-law as means to heal their grief. With his family gone, Louis finally decides to execute the unthinkable. He goes to Gage's grave and attempts to dig it, despite the ghost reappearing again to warn him against doing it. At the same time, Ellie gets a bad dream wherein the ghost warns her that Louis is going to do something bad. This causes Ellie to freak out and tell her mother, and so Rachel makes a phone call to the house to check up on her husband. As expected, Louis doesn't pick up because he's not at the house. Worried, she calls Judd wondering if Louis is with him, but he isn't either. With a bad feeling in the gut, Rachel decides to book a flight back home immediately. Meanwhile, Louis is still at the graveyard digging, and afterwards, he sits cradling his son's dead body for a while, before taking him to the Native American burial ground. During the flight back home, Rachel dreams about seeing the house in disarray, and sees her dead sister, who devilishly tells her that she and Gage are coming to get her. This causes Rachel to wake up and immediately rushes to her connecting flight, which is about to leave. Back to Louis, the woods are especially eerie tonight, but that doesn't deter him. On the way, he even comes across a screaming ghost, but keeps going anyway. We now return to Rachel, who is finally on a rental car back home, when she suddenly crashes by the side of the road. The ghost is still with her, and he tries telling Rachel that the car broke down because evil spirits don't want her to stop Louis from bringing their son back to life, but sadly Rachel couldn't hear. Unfortunately, she is too late. At this point Louis has succeeded in reburying Gage. Soon after Louise returns home, an undead Gage comes back to life and begins to climb out of his grave. With the car broken down, Rachel has no choice but to walk, until she hitches a ride with a passing truck. The little boy returns home and enters his father's room, removing a scalpel from one of his medical bags while Louis is asleep. Up next, Gage heads to Judd's house across the street, confusing the poor old man. As he goes to investigate, Gage taunts the old man and hides in his bedroom. But when Judd looks under the bed, the undead Gage slices the old man in the heel, causing him to bleed profusely. Gage comes out of hiding, and slashes his mouth, before sinking his teeth into the old man's throat and ripping it out. At the same time, Rachel finally makes it home, and could hear the sound of Gage laughing coming from Judd's house. She goes to investigate, and comes across Church with a bloody paw. Sensing something amiss, she steps inside the house, and could faintly hear Judd groaning in pain upstairs, followed by her sister Zelda calling her name. Oddly enough, she sees an apparition of Zelda, screaming and laughing at her, awakening her trauma. But when she opens her eyes again, she sees Gage. Gage tells her he brought her something, and shows her Louis' scalpel. Thinking nothing of it, Rachel hugs her son in disbelief, and screams when her son attacks her. In the morning, Louis wakes up to muddy small footprints all over the house, and notices that his scalpel is missing. Seeing this makes him realize that undead Gage must be up to no good, so he looks for him around the house. He then gets a phone call from his father-in-law asking how Rachel is doing since she got home, making Louis grow even more worried because his wife is nowhere to be found. The next time he gets a phone call, it is from undead Gage, claiming that he's at Judd's, and he finished playing with both Mommy and Judd. Concerned, Louis arms himself with shots of morphine, and heads to Judd's house. When he comes across Church, he distracts the cat with raw meat, and euthanizes it with a syringe. Up next, he heads inside the house, which now looks completely run down and freaky. He finds Rachel's bloody shoe, and his surrounding returns to normal, meaning Gage just played mind tricks on him. The father prepares the second shot of morphine and goes upstairs, where he finds Judd's maimed dead body and cries in horror. As he resumes his search, Gage drops Rachel's dead body from the attic, and jumps down to attack Louis. The little boy mercilessly maims him with the scalpel, until Louis manages to throw him aside. It is at this time that Louis picks up his syringe again, and injects Gage with morphine the next time the toddler approaches him. The father watches as the boy slowly loses consciousness and dies. The next thing he does is to pour gasoline all over Judd's house, and setting it on fire. As the house burns, Louis takes his wife's dead body and plans to resurrect her, ignoring the ghost's warnings once again. The movie ends with the now insane Louis walking down the path to the woods, headed for the place beyond the pet cemetery. After burying Rachel, Louis plays solitaire at home while waiting for his wife to come back to life. At midnight, an undead Rachel comes through the kitchen door, walking towards her husband. The two embrace while the wife reaches for a knife on the kitchen table, which leads to his demise.